Okay, so when we think about Vikings, the picture is usually, long ships, axes, maybe piles of gold. Not all treasures were silver, though.
Not at all. That's the common image, the sort of Hollywood version. The raids, the plunder.
Right, the frantic activity, the chaos.
Yeah.
But if you start digging a bit deeper, past the sagas, past the myths, you find that maybe the most valuable thing they took wasn't metal, it was people.
Exactly. People, and specifically women.
So today we're doing a deep dive into that hidden history. The systematic role women played in Viking raids.
Yeah.
Not just victims, right, but something more calculated.
Precisely. That's our mission here.
Yeah.
We want to move beyond just the battlefield stories and look at the evidence. We've got chronicles from the time, archaeology, genetics, even the silences in the Norse sagas themselves.
Silences, interesting.
Oh, yeah. Very telling. And all this evidence points towards the idea that the atrocities against women weren't just collateral damage, not regrettable accidents. No. They were a core strategy, calculated, serving really two big purposes. One, material fueling their economy, the thrall system, and two, psychological, a devastating way to fracture enemy communities, to break them from the inside.
Okay, let's anchor this. Give us a scene. Where does this really come into focus?
Let's go to Paris, or near Paris anyway. The year is AD 845, the Seine River.
Ragnar Lodbrok country.
That's the one. Part legend, part, well, sheer terror for the Franks. The chroniclers there recorded this massive fleet coming down the river, 120 ships.
120. Imagine seeing that heading your way.
Unthinkable. And the accounts, especially from monks near Saint-Denis who lived through it, they described the obvious chaos first. Burning farms, defenders slaughtered.
The usual playbook.
Yeah.
And the big ransom paid for Paris itself.
Yep, huge amount of silver. But then there's what you might call the quiet aftermath, the part that doesn't always make the main story.
Okay.
The captured women, wives, daughters, marched down to the ships, and the description is just chilling. They were screaming as if already drowning.
God. As if already drowning. That paints a picture.
It does. And then there's this little note, almost a throwaway line, tucked in the margin of one source. It says, "Some were never returned."
Some were never returned. Just like that.
Just like that. Think about what that means, Ransom might save the church treasures, might save a captured nobleman, maybe.
But not the women.
Not always. Their value wasn't just local anymore. They'd entered a different economy, a global one, really. The slave trade.
So the Vikings weren't just grabbing silver. They understood something deeper about value.
Absolutely. They understood how to inflict permanent damage, to really fracture a community. You didn't just take their wealth. You took the vessels of their future, their cultural continuity.
The women.
The women. By taking them, brutalizing them, you wounded the enemy's identity, their honor, their lineage, deeply, maybe permanently. That life, that woman, was the commodity they truly valued, more than silver, in a way.
Wow. Okay. That definitely sets the stage. It's much more deliberate than just smashing and grabbing.
There are more.
All right, let's unpack that. This cultural calculation. Okay, needing labor, needing slaves, that makes a grin sort of sense. But the intense focus on wives, daughters, and the psychological violence, the public humiliation. Why go that far?
It really digs into the core goal, which often wasn't just about loot. It was about cultural annihilation. Or at least establishing total dominance.
Annihilation, that's strong.
Well, think about it. Especially in places like England, Ireland, Francia. They weren't always just raiding. Sometimes they were settling, conquering, trying to erase the existing power, the existing lineage.
And women were key to that lineage.
Absolutely central. In these societies, women were seen as the carriers of culture. They passed down the language, the faith, the stories, the identity to the next generation.
So taking them wasn't just removing a person.
It was like hijacking the cultural DNA. Seize the women, brutalize them, force them to bear children for the captor. That imposes a new lineage. It's a way to systematically extinguish the old one. It's almost biological warfare for cultural control.
That reframes the brutality, doesn't it? It's less random rage, more precise, a tool.
Precisely. A calibrated act of cultural, even generational warfare. And the psychological impact. You have to imagine how crippling that was. Intentionally crippling.
How do we see that? In the records.
We see it in the language the chroniclers use. It's fascinating. They often don't dwell on the physical details of assault. Instead, they use phrases like, the women were dishonored or used shamefully.
Dishonored. That puts the focus on the social impact, the shame.
Exactly. The weapon wasn't just the act, it was the memory. A memory designed to be leveraged against her whole community. Because even if a woman survived, escaped, maybe was even ransomed back home, her body was often seen as, well, tainted, impure, condemned by what had happened.
So her suffering continued even after the Vikings left. And the community felt it too.
Yes, the shame wasn't just hers. It became a kind of strategic deterrent for her whole community, a wound that festered long after the raiders sailed away.
So the fear wasn't just will they come back. It was this internal shame paralyzing them.
That's a great way to put it. Paralyzed by shame. We actually see this explicitly in the Irish Annals. There's an entry for 821 talking about raiders out of Dublin.
Yeah.
It says they took women violently, and in doing so, they were grieving the land with lust.
Grieving the land with lust.
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah. It paints this picture of the whole countryside just wounded, not just by casualties, but by this pervasive sense of violation, the shame that hung over everyone. The raid might be local, but the grief, the shame, that was everywhere.
And it seems like the Vikings knew the power of making this visible. It wasn't always hidden away.
Oh, absolutely. Sometimes the brutality was theater, political theater. Chroniclers record assaults, especially on nuns or abbesses, happening right in front of priests and monks during monastery sacks.
Lindisfarne 793, the classic example.
Lindisfarne is the big one, yeah. Kicked off the whole era, really, and that spectacle was crucial.
Yeah.
People back then violating a consecrated woman right next to smashing relics and desecrating the altar.
It attacked their whole worldview.
It ruptured their sense of cosmic order, God's order. The brutality wasn't just physical, it was symbolic, aimed right at the heart of the community's spiritual strength and identity.
Okay, this is where you mentioned it gets really interesting. The silence. We have these horrific accounts from the victim side.
Right. Detailed, anguished accounts.
But then you look at the sagas, the stories the Norse told about themselves, written later,
Yeah.
and it all kind of vanishes.
It gets glossed over or just omitted, and that silence, that narrative gap, is incredibly telling. It's almost a historical marker in itself.
How so?
Take the Old English poem, The Battle of Malden. It describes this bloody defeat of the Anglo-Saxons by Vikings in 991.
Right, a famous poem. Heroic defeat.
Exactly. The poet laments the loss, the dead heroes, the aftermath, and he notes that the surviving wives would inevitably pass into the hands of enemies. And then
Then what?
the text just stops, breaks off, mid-thought almost. The scribe, or maybe the tradition itself, just refuses to spell out what happens next.
Wow. Leaves it hanging.
Completely hanging. It's this profound literary ellipsis, that gap. It's filled by the sheer unspoken horror everyone at the time understood.
They didn't need it spelled out.
They knew exactly what passing into the hands of enemies meant for women. It wasn't about ransom or marriage. It meant servitude, abuse, forced breeding, cultural erasure. The horror was so universally understood, maybe so profound, that they couldn't or wouldn't write it down.
So the refusal to say it, that actually preserved the horror?
In a strange way, yes. It confirms the universal understanding of the crime. The silence speaks volumes. It is, ironically, part of the history itself.
That silence. It's a chilling way to transition from the psychological warfare to the brutal economics of it all.
Yeah.
Thraldom,
Yeah.
slavery. You said it wasn't just a side effect, it was infrastructure.
Essential infrastructure,
Yeah.
absolutely fundamental. You simply cannot run the kind of expansionist society the Vikings had, the vast trade networks, the long-distance settlements, the sheer agricultural needs, without a massive source of unpaid labor.
So the whole system depended on it.
Completely. Their economy stretched from Greenland and Iceland in the west, all the way down the rivers of Eastern Europe to the Black Sea and beyond. It ran on thralls, enslaved people.
Men and women both, presumably.
Both, yes. Enslaved men were vital for things like shipbuilding, construction, heavy farming. But enslaved women, the thrall in Old Norse, they held these multiple overlapping roles that were arguably even more critical to the system.
Okay, what kind of roles are we talking about specifically for women? What made them so vital?
Well, there's the obvious domestic labor, of course, cooking, cleaning, managing the longhouse, farming tasks, but also specialized labor that created actual wealth, managing dairy production, processing hides, and crucially, textiles.
Textiles, like weaving.
Yes, a massive part of the economy.
Yeah.
Turning wool and flax into cloth, which was a major trade good. Female thralls were the engine of that. But perhaps their most important function, from the chieftain's perspective, was reproduction.
Breeding stock.
That's exactly how they were viewed and treated. Explicitly, they were expected, even mandated, to produce new generations, new workers, new warriors. And crucially, those children belonged entirely legally to the master, not to the mother.
The dehumanization is just stark. And
Yeah.
this is actually reflected in their laws. You mentioned the Gragas.
Yes, the medieval Icelandic law code, the Gragas. It's incredibly revealing because it codifies the thrall's status as non-person, legally property, chattel.
Like an animal or a tool.
Exactly like an animal or a tool. And you see this chillingly in how the law treated violence. If a master beat, abused, or sexually exploited his own thrall,
Let me guess. Nothing.
the law was silent. Zero legal comeback. Because legally, you can't damage your own property. It's yours to do with as you please.
But if someone else hurt your thrall?
Then the law kicks in instantly. If your neighbor struck or injured your thrall, they were guilty of theft or property damage.
So the concern wasn't the woman suffering.
Not at all. It was the economic loss to the owner, the damage to his asset, his labor source, that huge deafening silence in the law, the total lack of protection for the enslaved woman against her owner that tells you everything about centuries of sanctioned abuse and exploitation.
And this reality, it sometimes bleeds through even into the later sagas, right? Even when they try to sanitize things.
It does. The story of Melkorka is a powerful example. She appears in the Laxdæla saga, written in the 13th century.
Okay, what's her story?
Well, the saga says she was an Irish princess, captured young, sold into the household of a big Icelandic chieftain, Höskuld Dalakulsson.
So, enslaved royalty.
Yes, although the saga tries to focus on her beauty, her intelligence, but the cold facts are she was bought. She was used as breeding stock, she bore Höskuld a son, Olaf the Peacock, who became a major figure himself.
So the son gets the glory. What about her?
Her story is one of quiet resistance. Her only real act of defiance, the saga tells us, was to pretend to be mute. She refused to speak Norse to her master or his household.
Wow. Silence is resistance.
It was the only power she had left, maybe? A refusal to assimilate completely. She kept her Irish identity alive, apparently only speaking Irish to her son when they were alone.
So the saga celebrates the son's success, but it accidentally documents the mother's trauma.
Exactly. It reveals the forced integration of non-Norse people, non-Norse culture, right into the heart of Icelandic society, even if the saga writer didn't fully intend to highlight it.
And this wasn't just happening locally in Iceland or Scandinavia. This slave trade was massive, global even.
Oh, absolutely global for their world. A vast, complex network. You had major hubs. Dublin was huge, Hedeby in Denmark, Kiev in the east, and then the destination markets, places like Constantinople, the capital of Byzantium, or Cordoba in Islamic Spain.
How were they all connected?
By sea lanes, obviously, but also, crucially, by the river systems of Eastern Europe. The Norse, especially the Eastern Vikings, the Russes.
The ones who gave Russia its name?
Likely, yes. They were masters of the rivers. The Volga, the Dnieper, these were highways for trade, including the trade in people.
And we have outside observers who saw this.
We do, and their accounts are clinical. Horrifyingly so. Arab diplomats and geographers writing from places like Baghdad or Spain in the 10th century, Ibn Rushd al-Masudi.
What did they say?
They describe the Russes basically herding large numbers of people down these rivers like cattle. Ibn Rushd just states it bluntly. They treated their human cargo like livestock. The scale was enormous. Thousands upon thousands of people every year channeled south.
Heading towards the big empires in the south and east?
Primarily, yes. Towards the Abbasid Caliphate, towards Byzantium. These were wealthy, sophisticated markets with a huge demand for slaves.
And women were particularly valuable in those markets.
Extremely valuable, because in Constantinople, Baghdad, Cordoba, female slaves were in high demand for domestic work, yes, but also explicitly for concubinage and for producing children within those societies. They fetched top prices.
So the market dictated the preference.
To a large extent. And the market was so organized, the records even detail the grim process of market preparation.
What does it mean?
It means captives were literally primed for sale, fattened up like livestock, dressed in fine clothes they didn't own just for display, put on stages for buyers to inspect them.
Like objects.
Purely objects, their price measured in foreign currency. Often Islamic silver coins, dirhams from Baghdad or Cordoba. The Norse even adopted the word dirhams. That shows you how plugged into that global economy this human trafficking was. For many Viking chieftains, feeding that market was the point of raiding. That was the profit.
Okay, so if the sagas are silent and the Christian chronicles give one perspective, how do we actually hear from these women, or at least hear their story more directly?
That's where archaeology and science have become absolutely crucial. The ground, the bones, the DNA. They provide this irrefutable counter-narrative, testimony of forced migration suffering silenced lives.
So digging into the genetics first, you mentioned Iceland earlier.
Yes, Iceland is a stark case study. When scientists analyzed the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down the female line, and compared it to the Y chromosome DNA passed down the male line,
What did they find?
a huge asymmetry. The Y chromosomes were overwhelmingly Norse, Scandinavian, but the mtDNA, a massive proportion came from the British Isles, from Ireland and Scotland, mainly.
Wow. So the founding fathers were Norse, but the founding mothers were often Celts.
A significant number, yes. It paints a very different picture of settlement, doesn't it? Not just brave explorers setting out, but men arriving, often having captured or taken women from elsewhere en masse. It confirms this systematic movement of women was foundational.
That fundamentally changes the story. And can we see this at a more local level too, like in specific settlement?
Absolutely. Let's look at York. Jorvik, as the Vikings called it after they conquered it, a major Norse center in England in the 10th century.
What have archaeologists found there?
The skeletons unearthed in the Viking lairs of York tell brutal stories. They've found female skeletons from that period whose DNA clearly shows they originated in Ireland.
So captured and brought across the Irish Sea, slaves.
Very likely, yes. And their bones tell the story of their lives in Jorvik. Many died young. Really young, around 20, sometimes even still teenagers.
That's incredibly young. Why so early?
The physical evidence points to extreme hardship. Their skeletons show undeniable signs of heavy, constant physical labor.
How can you tell that from bones?
You look for specific markers, things like osteoarthritis, joint degeneration you'd normally only see in much older people. You see pronounced ridges and changes in the bone where muscles attached, indicating they were under constant severe strain.
Like they were literally worked to death.
It certainly looks that way.
Yeah.
These weren't honored Viking wives. These were women subjected to relentless toil, probably poor nutrition, little rest. Their bodies just gave out. The bones are like a ledger of their oppression.
God, that's bleak. And sometimes you find even more specific evidence on individual remains.
Yes. There's a particularly poignant example from Orkney, another Viking stronghold. The skeleton of a young woman, late teens again. Her DNA also points to an Irish origin. Her skeleton showed healed fractures on her nose. Several teeth had been shattered during her life. Clear signs of significant violence she endured.
Violence she survived, at least for a time.
Yes, and chemical analysis of her bones showed she'd lived in Orkney long enough for her diet to completely shift to the local Norwegian style. So she wasn't newly arrived. She'd been there, integrated into the household in some way, for years probably.
But how was she buried?
That's the key. She was buried with nothing. No jewelry, no grave goods, no markers of status, just put in the ground. That lack of adornment, combined with the evidence of violence and her foreign origin, strongly confirms her status. A captive, likely a thrall, whose life ended brutally and anonymously. A shallow grave for a life of suffering.
So putting all this together, the DNA, the bones, if we try to imagine the journey of one woman caught in this.
Her life essentially collapsed into a series of forced transfers. Seized in Ireland, maybe, or Francia, marched overland, loaded onto a ship like cargo, maybe sold in Dublin, perhaps transported again further east to the Baltic or down the rivers.
And her identity, her name.
Erased, deliberately forgotten or replaced. She wasn't, Eilis from Canuck anymore. She was just throw, slave. A generic label, a permanent state of non-personhood.
And often there was another layer to that erasure, right? Forced motherhood.
Yes. The thrall often carried that invisible scar, bearing a child conceived through rape or coercion by her owner, a child born of her oppressor.
And those children, were they considered thralls too?
Not always. Often, if the father was the master, the child might be acknowledged, raised within the Norse culture. They became Vikings themselves, warriors, traders. It fundamentally complicates any idea of a pure Norse lineage.
So the sagas might even celebrate these children.
Sometimes, yes. They're praised as strong, well-born by conquest, celebrating the mixing of bloodlines as adding strength.
But beneath that celebration,
beneath those lines is the silent, profound trauma of the mothers, the women who never consented. Their bodies, their wombs were turned into borderlands, I suppose, where the conqueror inscribed his victory generation after generation.
Is there an example of this, a known figure?
Well, think of Olaf Tryggvason. He became a famous king of Norway. His mother, Astrid, had herself been captured and enslaved for a time. The sagas focus on Olaf's later glory, his conversion to Christianity, his battles.
But they skate over the mother's experience.
They largely erased the foundational trauma. The story is about the heroic son, not the enslaved mother whose suffering lay beneath his rise to power. Her cuffs and chains are conveniently forgotten.
So, despite the chains, the silence in the sagas, the attempt to erase identity, did anything survive? Any hint of resistance or just persistence of the women's original culture?
Yes, remarkably, fragments did survive. Whispers of resistance, or maybe just cultural memory, smuggled forward in really intimate ways.
Like what? How can we possibly trace that?
Well, sometimes through language. Linguists find these odd little markers, Irish words, Anglo-Saxon words, even Slavic words, popping up unexpectedly in Icelandic or Scandinavian dialects centuries later. Words used within households. Suggesting captive women were keeping parts of their language alive. Maybe through lullabies sung to their children, maybe just in quiet persistence within the longhouse. You get this image, right? The woman humming a tune from her lost home, teaching her child a word in secret.
Wow. Language is a hidden anchor.
Exactly. And artifacts tell a similar story. Archaeology turns up things that just don't belong, according to the pure Norse narrative. Well, distinctive Slavic cone designs found buried in Scandinavian settlements, clearly brought by enslaved women from Eastern Europe. Or think about the foreign jewelry, intricate Irish pins, Anglo-Saxon brooches found in the graves of Viking men buried in England.
Trophies.
Spoils of war, yes, but also silent testimony. That brooch was once worn by a woman, pinned into her clothes. Now it lies with the man who likely enslaved her. It's a material link back to her lost life, her derailed history, a proxy for her story.
It's chilling how the heroic narratives, the sagas we have, just managed to reframe all this, though, to make the brutality sort of disappear.
It's narrative warfare, in a way. They consciously flattened the experience. Think about Egil's saga. Egil Skallagrimsson, the famous warrior poet, he boasts about raiding and taking women.
Yeah, he's a complex anti-hero.
Right. But when he talks about capturing women, he often lists it right alongside seizing cattle or silver, as if taking a wife by force was just like grabbing another chest of loot.
Reducing a human life to an inventory item.
Exactly. That deliberate equation, woman equals silver, woman equals property, it makes the human cost, the suffering, almost invisible. It's perhaps the most insidious form of historical silencing. Her story is only told, briefly and dismissively, through the voice of her captor.
And this wasn't just about domestic work or even breeding. You mentioned the textile trade earlier. This is part of a bigger economic engine, a cycle.
A vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. Let's go back to Dublin again. It was a massive center for the Vikings in the West, and the archaeology there is incredibly rich.
What does it show about women's work?
Sites like Woodquay have yielded huge quantities of textile working tools. Spindle whorls for spinning thread, pin beaters, loom weights for weaving. Tools overwhelmingly associated with women's labor.
And many of these women were captives.
The context strongly suggests it. Women brought in from the Irish countryside, maybe from Britain or elsewhere, put to work transforming raw fleece, mostly wool, into cloth, into wealth.
Okay, so walk us through that cycle. How did their forced labor fuel more violence?
It's horribly efficient. Step 1, capture women. Step 2, force them to spin and weave huge amounts of cloth. Step 3, sell that cloth, often abroad, maybe in England, maybe on the continent, maybe even traded for silver dirhams coming up from the Middle East.
But hey, they get the silver.
Step 4, use that silver to build more ships, buy more weapons, pay more warriors. Step 5, launch more raids, which capture more women. And the cycle starts again.
So the very threads they were forced to weave were, in effect, funding the capture of more women like them.
Precisely. Their own labor tightened the noose. It really underscores the scale of thraldom. It wasn't marginal, it was central.
Any estimates on how widespread it was?
It's hard to be exact, obviously, but historians analyzing the labor needs for agriculture, trade, settlement building, they estimate that by around the year 1000, maybe 10%, perhaps even more, of the population across the wider Scandinavian world, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, the settlements were thralls.
1 in 10 people.
At least. Entire economies, entire households were fundamentally dependent on the forced labor and subjugation of captured people. And female thralls were absolutely critical to making that system profitable.
There's one more account we need to touch on, I think.
Yeah.
The one from Ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat who traveled among the Russ's Vikings on the Volga River in 922.
Ah, yes. Ibn Fadlan's account. It's unique. A non-Norse eyewitness description of their culture, including their funeral rituals.
And it includes something particularly horrifying about a slave girl.
Deeply horrifying. He describes the funeral of a chieftain. Part of the elaborate ritual involved the sacrifice of a slave girl. Apparently, she volunteered, perhaps believing she'd join her master in the afterlife, maybe coerced, we don't know.
What happened to her?
Before the sacrifice, Fadlin records she was given large amounts of alcohol. Then, she was publicly, ritually sexually assaulted by the chieftain's closest companions. After that, she was killed, strangled, and stabbed simultaneously, and her body placed in the chieftain's ship before it was set ablaze.
My God. Public assault? Ritual killing?
It confirms, in the most brutal way possible, how the enslaved woman's body was viewed and used as a tool, a utility, for labor, for sex, for breeding during life, and then as a ritual object, a status symbol, even in death.
Total erasure of agency right to the very end.
Complete erasure. Her body was property used to serve the needs, economic, social, sexual, even spiritual, of the master culture. It's about as explicit as the historical record gets about the depth of that subjugation.
So we started this deep dive, hearing those screams from Paris in 845. And we've followed that thread of suffering across centuries, across continents really, from the Seine to the Volga, Dublin to Iceland. It connects back, doesn't it? This broad historical impact.
It absolutely does.
The popular image, the romantic image of the Viking adventurer, the explorer. It just can't hold up against this evidence, can it? It systematically overlooks this enormous weight of sorrow, particularly for the women who were conquered.
The romance just evaporates. It completely collapses under the weight of the evidence we've discussed. You know, the official narratives, the sagas written by the victors or their descendants, they chose silence, a calculated silence, maybe to preserve honor, maybe just to forget the ugliness.
But the ground remembers.
The ground remembers. That's the power of archaeology and science. The DNA doesn't lie. The bones, marked with the trauma of labor and violence, those broken wrists, the arthritis in young backs, the shattered teeth, they surface centuries later. The iron collars, the shackles found in trading hubs, they refuse to let that history be erased or romanticized.
It forces us to accept that conquest isn't just about kings and battles. It's written just as deeply, maybe more deeply, in the quiet, shattering suffering of ordinary people, especially women, who left no written record, no saga.
Exactly. They had no parchment, no runes carved for them, mostly. Their history was lived and endured in the body. But we have to listen for the echoes. We know some survived, some resisted in small ways.
The lullabies, the artifacts.
Yes. Passing on fragments of language, of culture, right under the noses of their captors, planting those seeds of difference within the Norse world itself, subtly undermining the very cultural purity the system tried to enforce. Others just endured until the end, their names lost, remembered only as thrall.
When those chroniclers wrote, "Wives into the hands of enemies," and then stopped.
They thought they were being brief, perhaps, or maybe protecting sensitivities, but in reality, they were capturing the most profound, terrifying truth of the Viking Age. That unspoken reality hung over everything.
Which leaves us with a question, doesn't it? What other histories, what other voices are still out there, still buried, waiting to be uncovered in ways the official records ignored?
That's the challenge for us now, isn't it? To look beyond the grand narratives, to recognize that sometimes the deepest history, the most crucial memory, is stored in the silences, in the fragments, in the unexpected places. The sagas are silent on this for a reason. Maybe they couldn't face the fact that the pure Norse bloodline they celebrated was built on conquest, violence, and the systematic subjugation of others.
So the final thought for you, the listener.
When you read those epic tales of Viking glory, listen harder. Listen past the clash of swords, past the tales of long voyages. Listen across the centuries, across the rivers and seas. Try to hear that other sound, the echo maybe of bare feet hitting wet earth on a forced march. That sound, that quiet suffering. That might be the most honest record we have.